strategies?
Test-taking strategies are both test management strategies and test-wiseness strategies. Test management strategies are strategies for dealing with your timing, making sure you finish a test in the allotted amount of time, strategies for checking out the instructions. If it's a reading comprehension test, it may be strategies that include reading the questions first rather than going through the text and then going back and trying to figure out how to answer questions and realizing you didn't pay attention to material the questions are asking. Those are test management strategies. Test wiseness strategies are strategies for seeing whether the material somehow signals your correct answer, like maybe only one response is grammatically correct, or using your knowledge of the world and answering the question on that basis and realizing that several of the choices are absurd based on reality, they couldn't possibly be true. Noticing that one of the choices is longer than the other three and therefore it's probably likely. Or saying to yourself, gee, they haven't had B is the right choice for a long time, I bet it's B. Those are test wiseness type strategies. The third kind of strategy actually that takes place when people are doing tests are language learner strategies. Reading, writing, speaking, listening strategies, vocabulary strategies, grammar strategies. These are going to play a role as well.
Is it beneficial to perfect your test wiseness strategies?
I would say yes, as much as people might frown on test wiseness strategies because they're the wrong way to get a right answer. Survival is the name of the game, and a respondent is going to want to get through a test as effectively as possible, and it may include using these strategies. The research literature would suggest that yes, the use of test wiseness strategies does make a difference, so it's helpful to keep them in mind.
How do you tell a test-taking strategy from a language learner strategy in actuality?
That's a very good question. It's a tough one. Sometimes when you're looking at data, when you're looking at verbal response data, you can't always tell where the border is between a reading strategy, like looking for markers of cohesion and coherence, and checking out of the meaning of a vocabulary word from context, and test-taking strategies, a test management strategy. But usually the test-taking strategies, whether they're test management or test wiseness, are focused on dealing with the specific test, whereas a language learner strategy is focusing on dealing with language. That's where the distinction lies.
Will the use of test-taking strategies improve a student's performance on a language test?
I would like to think it would, yes. I would like to think it would. Over the many years I've been looking at tests, I would say it can, particularly with tests that learners may not have a good handle on. A closed test or a C test or one of these other kinds of tests that's a bit peculiar to them, then strategizing can be crucial actually in getting through the test effectively.
Does learning style preference have anything to do with the test-taking strategies that respondents use?
It probably does, and it's subtle, and it's something teachers might not be very aware of. I'm reminded of the work that Vivian Berry did with introversion, extroversion, and how if you put an introvert and an extrovert together in a dyad, in a speaking test, it may shut down the extrovert and have the extrovert get a poor score because they're in this environment with an introvert. So that's one concern. Then also there's the issue of, for example, say someone has the cognitive style preference of being concrete sequential, and they're given an inference item on a reading passage. They may feel the need to find that material in the text because they're concrete sequential. If they're random intuitive, they're willing to go with the flow and just assume, well, let me see, based on intuition, what do I think the answer is? The concrete sequential learner might absolutely keep looking in the text, spending extra unnecessary time. So learning style preference can creep in to responses on language tests in ways that the test giver, test constructor, may not be aware of. It's definitely a factor.
How do we find out what strategies the respondents are using on a given test?
I think through verbal report. And if it's a listening test, a speaking test, it's more difficult. You kind of have to do it after the fact, not while they're engaged in the activity. If it's a writing test, if it's a reading test, it's possible to collect those verbal report data while they're doing the items, though sometimes it's intrusive. It's something you have to check out. Another issue, by the way, would be whether or not there are certain test-taking strategies that are more useful for certain tests. And I would say absolutely that a certain test is, which I alluded to before, like say there's a closed test, a C test that a student has not had experience with. It's going to probably trigger test-specific strategies meant to handle that kind of test. And all the more reason then to familiarize the students with those kinds of tests, those kinds of tasks, get them ready so that when they go into the testing situation, they know what to do.
Do respondents at different proficiency levels use different strategies?
Yes, I'd say that's the case. That the students at high proficiency level, for example, are going to have strategies. They're going to be able to use strategies involving benefiting from the context, using powers of inference, more so than more elementary students who aren't going to have as rich a command of the language. However, what's more fascinating here is that they may use a lot of the very same strategies. It's not so much a matter of them using the same strategies, it's how they use them. That's why these measures that ask for frequency of strategy use, to what extent did you use such and such a strategy in responding to this item, are misleading. Because it's not just a matter of frequency of use, it's a matter of the quality of use, or just how you use the given strategy.
Does testing method have an impact on choice of test-taking strategies?
Yes, it very well can. All tasks aren't created equal, and some tasks or testing methods are going to prompt certain strategies, like closure on a closed test. When you have every seventh word you need to fill in the blank, it's going to promote or prompt a certain way of dealing with that closure. Just like if you're in a pragmatic assessment, a pragmatics where you're doing a speech act role play, it's going to call on your powers of remembering strategies specific to that speech act and more general strategies and so forth. So most definitely, the task, the testing method is going to trigger or impact the choice of test-taking strategies.
Does it matter what language the respondent is being strategic in, whether L1 or L2?
That's a very good question. And I think the research literature is mixed on that. And I personally think it has a lot to do with your style preference. There are going to be learners that feel more comfortable strategizing in native language, even those who are advanced learners and respondents on tests. And others who are going to favor doing their thinking, doing their strategizing in the target language. So I don't think we can draw a hard and fast rule here, and I certainly don't think we want to be prescriptive and tell respondents, you better be thinking in the target language. It's going to vary from individual to individual.
What percentage of a test like the TOEFL would be susceptible to test-wiseness strategies?
Very interestingly, the TOEFL, some research has suggested that maybe half of the items on the TOEFL are susceptible to test-wiseness strategies. All the more reason then to bear that in mind, to look for cases where items are going to influence each other, that they're not independent of one another. It's very hard to create a test, to construct a test that way, where each item is its own separate entity. Rather, they are going to be related. So for that reason, if you get stuck on an item, you may want to go ahead to an item further along, and sure enough, you're going to find in that item a clue or an answer to a previous item you got stuck on. Now, I know some tests don't allow you to go back, but those that do, for those that do, then this kind of test wiseness strategy can make a difference. But definitely to look for choices that don't seem rational, reasonable, given the way the world works, and those kinds of things make a difference. And yes, so test wiseness strategies are important to bear in mind as you go through a high-stakes test like the TOEFL.
Do strategy training materials help respondents do better on high-stakes tests?
Yeah, on this one I want to refer to my notes to make sure I get this right, because there's one study here that compared high and low scores, indicating that high scores tended to do one set of things, low scores tended to do another. And this is what's worrisome about these professional or commercial approaches to getting you revved up for a test. The higher scorers focused on understanding the passage. The lower scorers were trying to work around the passage. Like they'd had all this training in how to do tests, so they're going to focus on word-level strategies rather than on the comprehension of the passage altogether. The better scorers use strategies taught by the coaching school, but only as an auxiliary to comprehension, whereas the lower scorers use the strategies as a way of circumventing comprehension. And this is what's worrisome. Strategies aren't meant to have you avoid trying to understand the text. You should want to try to understand the text and just use the strategies to complement that. And then finally, the high scorers personalize their strategy use, whereas the low scorers followed the coaching school training mechanically. And that's what's worrisome too, that somebody takes one of these crash methods to do well on the TOEFL or one of these other tests, and they buy into it without engaging in their own thought processes. So in short, test-taking strategies can be a benefit when and if used wisely.